Good morning to everyone. I am delighted to be the first speaker of the virtual symposium on the many phases of becoming a parent. My background is in demography, and I've been studying trends and shifts in fertility and reproduction, especially in European countries. And this is the main topic of the presentation of my talk for the next half an hour. I will give you some overview of fertility and reproduction trends during the last decade, 10 to 15 years, during the period of economic recession in Europe and after the ending of economic recession. And I would like to speculate and discuss some of the drivers of these fertility trends and also give some thoughts about the possible future developments, especially in the view of the ongoing coronavirus pandemics. I have no commercial or financial conflicts interests pertaining to this presentation. We all know that reproduction has been delayed in the last decades in Europe, and the efficient contraception and assisted reproduction have greatly increased our control over reproduction, which means in a European context also, and especially, preventing unplanned births and pregnancies. We have seen around many countries, including most of the middle-income countries, a universal shift to small family size. So this is no longer just a European phenomenon. And of course, countries, societies are changing, and with that, families are changing. There are new pressures. Life course is becoming longer as people have higher and higher life expectancy and experience increasing longevity. So the question on when to have kids is becoming increasingly critical. So the long-lasting shift to later reproduction brings many challenges, as the later and later decisions to become parents are obviously clashing with the biological reality and often imply unplanned childlessness or infertility among many women and men who would like to become parents. This means often reproductive plans remain unrealized, and this is one of the reasons behind low or very low fertility rates in many European countries, including Spain and Southern European countries. Now, one big trend in fertility rates since the onset of the economic recession around 2008 has been a decline in period fertility rates across all highly developed countries, which used to form a group of countries with relatively high fertility rates. So this is one of the puzzles of fertility trends in the last 12 years. You can see on this graph countries listed by their total fertility rate in 2008. These are the blue bars. And then compare this with the total fertility rate these countries have 10 years later in 2018. In each and every of them, perhaps with the exception of France, we observe remarkable declines in fertility rates. So all countries which used to have moderately high or relatively high fertility rate for this group of low fertility countries in Europe and the Anglo-Saxon countries outside Europe don't have such high fertility rates anymore and have shifted more closer towards a middle range position in fertility, towards countries which used to be in the middle of their fertility distribution. Now, fertility rates declined also in a number of countries which used to have, which already had low fertility rates 10, 15 years ago. And this also includes Spain, which actually belongs to countries with the smallest family size globally. And fertility rates in Spain are nowadays lower than they were 10 or 12 years ago. Now, I mentioned these fertility declines were especially surprising in countries which used to be used to having relatively high fertility rates in Europe and outside Europe. And some of them were very proud in being able to support families, women and men, in making childbearing decisions. This obviously includes all the Nordic countries. And as you see from these media representations, some of these countries have been shocked, and the issue of fertility declines have been discussed extensively in the media. You see the headlines, for instance, for Denmark, low birth rate is approaching epidemic. Finland has a massive baby problem. Norwegian Prime Minister urges Norwegians to make babies. Who would have thought 10, 12 years ago that we would be seeing such headlines, such news about countries which used to be always admired or which used to be admired for their family-friendly policies and high fertility rates? This is an outline of topics which I would like to discuss briefly in the next 25 or so minutes. And I hope that towards the end, I will have some time to briefly speculate about the impact of the coronavirus on future fertility rates. Now let's go back to the period of the Great Recession starting around 2007, 2008, and the post-recession period. At the time or before the time, demographers have often discussed the bifurcation in fertility rates, the division of highly developed rich countries seemingly into two groups. As you can see on this picture of family size, number of children among women born in 1974, by the time they reach the end of their reproductive period around age 42 to 45. And this division is quite clearly visible there. Western European countries, Northern European countries, North America, Australia, New Zealand, all have relatively high family size among these women, around 2 kids. In Northern America, specifically the United States, even a bit higher. All other regions, including Eastern Asia, China, obviously also Southern European countries, as well as the 3 German-speaking countries in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, have much lower family size, around 1.5, 1.6 kids per woman, and Spain actually is yet a little bit lower, around 1.4 among the countries with family size globally. So there have been an extensive discussion on why is this division, why is this bifurcation happening, and factors like labor market uncertainties, differences in family policies, gender inequalities, culture differences, norms, and so on and so forth were put forward to explain these divisions. However, as I mentioned, many of these higher fertility countries, all of these higher fertility countries actually experienced fertility downturns in the last decade or so. And as a result, much of this bifurcation, much of this division have diminished during the 2010s, as you also partly see on this picture of regional differences in fertility rates since the year 2000. There are also some specific trends in individual regions. I can mention, for instance, continuing fertility increase in Eastern European countries such as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in 2000s and much of 2010s until about 2015. During the period when these countries experienced both economic upturns, economic improvements most of the years after huge declines and instability of the 1990s, and then also new family policies which were meant to support childbearing and promote childbearing. Now, this is no longer the case in the last 3 years. All these countries were experiencing rapid declines in their fertility rates as they experienced economic downturns, conflicts, and maybe also the effects of family policies have started waning to some extent. These are examples of several specific countries, of individual countries, which used to have higher fertility rates to show you the extent of their fertility declines in the last 10, 12 years. And I can name, for instance, the example of Finland, which used to be among the relatively higher fertility countries in Northern Europe, and now ranks among low or very low fertility countries in Europe. And we compare this with fertility in Southern European countries. There has been a downturn to some extent during the economic recession, and then a little bit of a recovery to some extent around 2015 after the recession, but then the latest trend goes again towards the downturn. Southern European countries actually form a group of lowest fertility countries globally together with East Asia, which is another region that has experienced a rapid decline to very, very low levels of fertility rates, with the extreme case of South Korea now having total fertility rate around 0.92 last year, and this is going to decline further this year. The causes of extreme low fertility in East Asia are partly shared with Southern Europe, but there are also a lot of specific factors in East Asia, including very strong link between fertility and marriage, where the normative expectations about women's role within marriage and also rigid labor market, which expects high involvement, high commitment, also among women and mothers, make it very difficult for women to decide to marry and have children. And as a result of that, increasing numbers of women have been on birth strikes, not marrying, remaining childless through their reproductive lives. I've already mentioned a big megatrend in rich countries in the last 50 years has been a postponement transition, a shift to ever later timing of first birth, ever later timing of reproduction, when the question when to have kids becomes a key issue of decision making for many prospective parents. We are living longer and longer lives, and it makes sense that we are shifting the decision to have children, also because we spend many more years in education. Nowadays, many young adults are finishing education at the age of 27, 28, maybe perhaps 10 years later than their parents did. And the life expectancy nowadays in Spain, Japan, and many countries is over 80. From this perspective, and also from the economic perspective, where especially mothers are punished much less in terms of income loss in their labor market when they have kids later in life than when they have them earlier in life. The same goes for their career development. So we can speculate whether 40 is the new 30 in reproduction. And as I mentioned, most of the economic, social, and family rationales speak for delayed parenthood. I can also mention that families which are formed later in life, couples and women who have kids later in life are much more stable. These couples are much more stable than those who have kids earlier in life and who suffer much higher divorce and dissolution rates. There is even some research suggesting that more mature parents, those age 35 plus or those having kids at age 35 plus, have higher levels of happiness than those having kids relatively early in life. This slide illustrates the continuing trend towards ever later first births in Europe, but also in some countries outside Europe. Currently, South Korea is the champion of very late parenthood, with South Korean women approaching the age of 32 on average when they have their first child, and Spain is very, very closely trailing South Korea. So Spain is the champion of late, very late parenthood within Europe. But all countries, even countries which still have much lower age at parenthood, are following more or less a similar trajectory of increasing age at having first child, especially after the year 1990, after the regime change in state socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And the mirror image of this is the continuous strong decline in early fertility rates, including teenage fertility rates across Europe and also in countries like the United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand, which used to have much higher fertility rates of teenagers in the past and young adult women in the past. Another way to illustrate this shift to late parenthood for the case of Spain is to look at the distribution of first birth rates by age. In 1980, the peak age at having first child was 23. In 2016, it was 31. This is a difference of just one generation, approximately 36 years. And within one generation, the age at having first child, 31, which was unusual in 1980, is now common. And the early ages at parenthood, which were very common in 1980, have become common now. The consequence of that is an ever-rising share of women having children above the age of 40, and Spain has the highest proportion of these mothers in Europe. About 7% of Spanish kids nowadays are born to mothers over age 40. And it's not surprising that the sharpest increases in late parenthood, late motherhood, are found among women having first or second child. What has been driving these trends towards lower and later reproduction in most parts of Europe? Not surprisingly, during the period of the economic recession, economic uncertainty, especially rising unemployment, had a strong impact on fertility rates and has caused a renewed shift to delayed childbearing, which was a little bit slowing down in the previous period, in the 2000s. Together with two of my colleagues, Anna Matysiak and Daniele Vignoli, we have tried to model and estimate the impact of economic downturn on total fertility rates in subnational regions across Europe, and especially in Southern European countries, most of all in Greece and Spain, the impact was substantial, contributing to about 0.1 to 0.25 to the observed declines in total fertility rates. In other words, explaining most of the observed declines in fertility rates during the period of 2008 to 2014 in these regions. However, the puzzling part of fertility developments is what explains the fertility declines after the end of the recession, when the conventional expectation among demographers would be that fertility rates would be recovering hand in hand with economic recovery and improving employment situation after 2012. What we observe from different countries is that first birth rates are still falling faster often than higher order births. So people are postponing the birth of their first child. And that fertility falls have been especially pronounced in many countries among migrants, ethnic minorities, and women with lower socioeconomic status. What seems to be happening is that employment conditions are increasingly important for the decision to have a child. Having a stable job becomes a key factor in fertility decision making. And there is some evidence of a birth squeeze, uh, of a squeeze in birth decisions among young generation, among young adults who are still suffering a lot of instability and uncertainty on the labor market. It seems that especially young people are increasingly facing precarious, irregular, and poorly paid jobs, as many of the well-paid jobs in the middle of education distribution have been disappearing. So even after the end of the economic recession, when, for instance, in Britain unemployment was declining to very low levels, most people who wanted to get employed, they found employment, but they remained poorly paid and often had unstable jobs. As you can see on this headline from The Guardian, about 1.5 years ago, 4 million British workers were living in poverty despite having a job. So a new phenomenon of low unemployment combined with low wages in many European countries. Spain and Italy are in a different situation, having high unemployment, dysfunctional labor market. There is quite a bit of literature on how young generation is not doing very well financially and in other aspects compared with the previous with the previous generations. And one of the factors which has been extensively documented is that the relative income, so income of young adults compared to the general adult population, have declined in the last 10-12 years across many countries in Europe. On this map, all countries which are in yellow to red color, yellow, orange, or red color, are countries where young adults have experienced a relative decline in their economic standing compared to all adults. What we know from the evidence from the United States is that expensive housing is making many people postponing parenthood. Women living in metropolitan areas with most expensive housing are the latest to have their first child, irrespective of their education status. And housing prices have been skyrocketing in many parts of Europe. Another piece of evidence which we have observed in many parts of Europe is that there have been more and more young adults not living with a partner, either still living with parents, which is very typical for Southern European countries, including Spain, or living as singles in shared living or in other non-family arrangements. And we observe this trend even in a country like Finland, where very few young adults remain with parents at age 28, and this hasn't been changing over time. But the share of especially men who live single in shared accommodation or in other arrangements without kids, without family, has been increasing over time. And this matters demographically. Obviously, these people are often not thinking of reproduction. They may not even have a partner to have kids with. And when surveys are being made about childlessness intentions, they correlate very strongly with living arrangements, with people who live single and without a partner having far higher childlessness intention than those who have a partner. There have been other things happening in the last decade or so, and climate change, concerns about climate change, concerns about all kinds of insecurities, uncertainties, including political polarization, are arguably making many young people to rethink parenthood, rethink their parenthood plans. And there is a group, probably a small group of people who claim they don't plan to have kids because they are concerned about the future of our planet and the environment. Now, when we think about different trends coming together, it's becoming increasingly challenging for the women to plan kids later in life. We know that reproductive ideals remain broadly stable. About 6 out of 10 women across Europe are having an ideal of 2 kids, but at the same time, slightly more are probably intending to stay childless. Now, many, despite this ideal of having 2 kids, more and more women and men are remaining childless at age 35. And as more of them who are still childless are intending to have a child in the future, which you can see in this picture, it's becoming challenging for them to realize these childbearing plans as they hit, as many of them are hitting infertility or encountering other difficulties with realizing their plans at a late reproductive age. This is also obvious from the data. For instance, a survey on fertility intentions in Australia, which I analyzed with several of my colleagues, uh, clearly shows that especially for women age 38 plus, probability of realizing their fertility intention is going sharply down, differently from men who are still relatively successful in realizing their fertility plans at late childbearing ages. Before my time is up, let me speculate briefly about the consequences of the coronavirus crisis on fertility rates. I would like to make a clear distinction between short-term and long-term effects of the coronavirus on fertility rates. If we think about short-term effects, think of factors like lockdowns, the immediate crises at the start of the first wave of the coronavirus, school closures, short-term economic shocks to many people who were out of jobs, maybe paid but were not working regularly. A popular perception is often that this may result in a COVID baby boom because many couples are spending more time at home, maybe they are bored, maybe they have more time to have sex, to engage in intimate relations. However, this speculation is not supported by past evidence on the effects of different short-term shocks. One should consider much more possible effects of stress of the situation for many couples, dealing with unexpected situation, with kids at home, homeschooling, and so on and so forth, and the fact that many couples were separated during this period. So this also means fewer opportunities for dating or moving to live together. So I would make an argument that we are likely to see a big baby bust in the early part of the year 2021. And this is also supported by surveys of fertility intention, including this early survey from the United States, which has been done in late April, early May, and found that 1/3 of the US women reported they wanted to delay childbearing or have fewer kids as a consequence of the insecurities, uncertainties they were facing during the pandemic stage of the pandemic. A similar situation for Europe. I would argue that longer-term effects will not be very different in terms of having a negative effect on birth rates in the next years, because the first COVID crisis is likely to turn into a longer-term economic crisis when we will be facing negative economic and labor market consequences of the coronavirus crisis for some years to come, including the government actions, because the government will need to start balancing their budgets, which are which have been bleeding because of extra expenditures they were making. So all of this points out that there is an uncertain future of reproduction. And as you can see on this cartoon, people are probably not sure whether they would like to bring a child into this crazy, messed up world, as they might have thought in the past, but this is more pertinent than ever before. Reproduction is increasingly optional, uncertain, delayed, and negotiated between partners. And there are many things which remain to be explored in the future, including multifaceted effects of internet and technological change on the lives of young adults, the role of new pressures and norms related to parenthood, all the concerns about climate change and new anxieties about the future, including now during the coronavirus pandemic. And one factor which I haven't mentioned much, the quality shift towards very intensive parenting and orientation towards high achievement of kids, especially in East Asia. And of course, we are discussing all of this with experts in reproduction. So mentioning once again infertility, possibly due to postponing parenthood, and the important role of assisted reproduction, including egg freezing technology for enabling women and couples to have kids at later ages, is also of key importance and will become part of family policy debates in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.